October 15, 1944, 3:47 in the afternoon. Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The mess hall stands silent except for the distant hum of industrial fans cutting through humid southern air. Rows of metal tables stretch empty under fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows on concrete floors, still damp from the morning's cleaning. 312 German prisoners of war have refused to eat American rations for 21 days straight. Their bodies are weakening, their resistance hardening, their pride intact despite the slow starvation gnawing at their strength. In the kitchen, steam rises from enormous steel pots filled with regulation beef stew that will go untouched again today. The waste bothers everyone. American taxpayers feeding enemies who won't eat, military resources squandered on stubborn pride, medical supplies stretched thin treating prisoners whose hunger strike threatens to become a death march. But today, something different is about to happen. Something that will challenge every assumption about enemy and ally, about respect and recognition, about the power of food to bridge chasms that military protocol insists must remain unbridgeable. Cornelius Washington adjusts his white apron and checks the clock. For 3 weeks, he has watched German soldiers waste away rather than consume meals prepared according to American military standards. For 3 weeks, he has seen pride become a slow-acting poison, cultural resistance transform into biological self-destruction. Today, he carries a different menu, one that will force everyone in this camp to reconsider what it means to show respect to an enemy, what it costs to maintain dignity, and how a black cook in segregated America might understand something about honor that escaped both German prisoners and American officers. In war, pride can kill faster than bullets, but sometimes it takes an enemy to teach us what home really means. And sometimes it takes someone society considers lowest to demonstrate the highest form of human recognition. This is a story about hunger that couldn't be satisfied with food, about resistance that required surrender, about dignity that demanded the courage to cross boundaries that institutional hatred insisted were permanent. It's about the moment when understanding transcended uniform, when humanity overcame regulation, when one man's choice to see enemies as people transformed 300 prisoners from walking corpses back into human beings. Camp Aliceville sprawled across 2,000 acres of Alabama cotton country, surrounded by double-wire fencing and watchtowers that cast long shadows over barracks housing German soldiers captured during the North African and Italian campaigns. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were Afrika Korps veterans, Wehrmacht officers, men who had fought with distinction before circumstances beyond their control delivered them to American soil as defeated enemies, requiring containment, processing, and eventual repatriation. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment, adequate nutrition, medical care sufficient to maintain health during captivity. American military efficiency provided these requirements through standardized procedures designed to process large numbers of prisoners with minimal administrative burden and maximum security. The system worked. Except when cultural differences created unexpected resistance, when pride proved stronger than hunger, when prisoners chose slow death rather than accept food that violated their sense of dignity and cultural identity. The hunger strike had begun with complaints about taste, evolved into protests about preparation methods, and hardened into absolute refusal that transformed mealtime into daily confrontation between American authority and German resistance. Medical officers monitored weight loss, documented declining health, recommended forced feeding that military lawyers advised against. Camp Commander Albert Thompson faced a bureaucratic nightmare. Prisoners dying in American custody not from abuse, but from their own stubborn refusal to accept adequate nutrition. The paradox cut deeper than administrative inconvenience. These same German prisoners received better medical care than Black Americans in many Southern hospitals, lived in barracks superior to housing available to Black soldiers on the same base, ate food prepared to higher nutritional standards than meals served in segregated facilities throughout the region. Yet, they rejected everything, demanded something indefinable, something that American military culture couldn't identify or provide. Military logic demanded simple solutions to complex problems. Hungry prisoners should eat available food. Enemy soldiers should accept defeat gracefully. Captured forces should appreciate humane treatment regardless of menu preferences. The system assumed that survival instincts would eventually overcome cultural resistance, that biology would defeat ideology, that 3 weeks without adequate nutrition would convince even the most stubborn prisoners to accept American rations prepared according to regulation standards. But German resistance had its own logic, its own requirements for maintaining honor under circumstances that had already stripped away freedom, autonomy, military purpose, and national identity. Food represented the final frontier, the last area where prisoners could assert some control over their circumstances, where cultural identity could resist complete assimilation into American military processing. Refusing American meals became a way to maintain connection to homeland, to preserve some fragment of dignity in circumstances designed to reduce human beings to administrative problems requiring efficient resolution. Heinrich Müller, a Hauptmann who had commanded a panzer company before British forces captured him at El Alamein, emerged as the unofficial leader of prisoner resistance. His authority among fellow captives derived not from military rank, but from his ability to articulate what the hunger strike represented: not mere stubbornness, but principled refusal to accept cultural erasure disguised as humane treatment. For Müller, eating American food meant accepting defeat at a level deeper than military surrender, acknowledging that German identity was negotiable, that survival required abandoning everything that made survival meaningful. The American officers faced their own constraints. Camp regulations required maintaining prisoner health while preventing security breaches, providing adequate nutrition while maintaining discipline, respecting Geneva Convention requirements while asserting American authority over defeated enemies. Colonel Thompson understood that prisoner deaths from starvation would create administrative disasters, but forced feeding would violate international law and military ethics. The situation demanded creative solutions that military training hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, the black service staff who prepared meals, cleaned facilities, and maintained camp infrastructure remained largely invisible to both German prisoners and American officers. Segregation created parallel worlds within the same physical space, white officers managing German prisoners while black soldiers performed essential labor that kept the facility functioning. The irony escaped no one who cared to notice. Black Americans providing better living conditions for German enemies than they could access in their own segregated society. Cornelius Washington occupied a unique position in this complex hierarchy. As head cook for the prison facility, he supervised meal preparation for over 1,000 people daily: prisoners, guards, administrative staff, medical personnel. His Louisiana background had taught him that food carried cultural meaning beyond mere nutrition, that recipes preserved identity across generations, that cooking could express respect or contempt depending on attention to tradition and technique. He understood something about the German hunger strike that American officers missed entirely. The insight came gradually, through careful observation of prisoner behavior during the few occasions when German soldiers accepted American food. They ate mechanically, without pleasure, as if consuming medicine rather than meals. Their complaints focused not on quantity or quality, but on unfamiliarity. The wrongness of flavors that satisfied hunger without satisfying cultural memory. The absence of seasonings and preparation methods that connected food to homeland. Cornelius had learned cooking from his grandmother, who had fed plantation workers with whatever ingredients were available, transforming limitation into creativity, making familiar flavors from unfamiliar resources. During the Depression, she had taught him that hunger was about more than empty stomachs, that people needed food that reminded them of home, that nourished identity as well as body. that preserved dignity even when circumstances stripped away everything else. The research began quietly, during off-duty hours when Cornelius could examine German Army field manuals captured during various campaigns. The manuals included detailed information about standard rations, preparation methods, seasoning preferences that maintained troop morale under difficult conditions. He discovered that German military cuisine emphasized specific combinations of salt, caraway, and preserved vegetables that created familiar tastes, even when prepared with limited ingredients in field conditions. The revelation was simple but profound. German prisoners weren't rejecting American generosity. They were rejecting American ignorance of what food meant to people separated from everything familiar. Everything that connected them to identity, culture, homeland. The hunger strike represented not ingratitude, but desperate attempt to preserve some fragment of who they were before captivity reduced them to numbers requiring administrative processing. Armed with this understanding, Cornelius began experimenting. Using ingredients available through military supply channels, he developed methods for recreating approximate versions of German field rations. The bread with caraway seeds that reminded soldiers of homeland bakeries, the soup preparations that echoed family recipes, the preserved meat combinations that German military kitchens had perfected for maintaining morale during extended campaigns. The challenge was creating familiar flavors using American ingredients, translating cultural memory into practical cooking within the constraints of military regulations and available supplies. The preparation required weeks of careful testing, adjustment, refinement. Cornelius worked during early morning hours before regular meal preparation began, using small quantities of ingredients to perfect recipes that could later be scaled up for mass production. He studied not just ingredients but techniques, the importance of slow cooking for certain preparations, the sequence of seasoning that created layered flavors, the visual presentation that made food recognizable as well as edible. October 15th. The moment arrived without fanfare, announced only by subtle changes in kitchen activity that most observers wouldn't notice. Instead of standard American stew, Cornelius prepared what German soldiers would recognize as Eintopf, a one-pot meal combining meat, vegetables, and seasoning in proportions that echoed homeland cooking. Instead of regulation bread, he served dense loaves embedded with caraway seeds that released familiar aromas when sliced. Instead of American coffee, he brewed ersatz coffee from chicory and grain that approximated the substitute beverages German soldiers had consumed during wartime shortages. The transformation was immediate and visible. German prisoners who had shuffled listlessly through meal lines for 3 weeks suddenly paused, inhaling deeply as familiar scents reached them. Conversations that had been reduced to essential communication began expanding as prisoners recognized flavors they hadn't tasted since leaving European soil. Heinrich Müller, who had maintained rigid resistance for 21 days, found himself confronting food that challenged every assumption about American cultural indifference. The first taste was tentative, suspicious, prepared for disappointment. But the combination of seasonings, the texture of properly prepared ingredients, the care evident in preparation methods that respected German preferences, it was close enough to homeland cooking that memory and hunger combined to overcome political resistance. One prisoner broke, then another. Then entire tables of soldiers began eating with an eagerness that had been absent since their capture. Heinrich watched his carefully maintained unity crumble as soldiers who had endured starvation for principle suddenly confronted American meals that acknowledged their cultural identity. The moral calculation that had justified the hunger strike, resistance to cultural erasure disguised as humane treatment, became complicated when treatment actually demonstrated cultural awareness, when American cooking reflected understanding rather than indifference. The conversations that followed required careful navigation of pride, gratitude, and the complex emotions that arise when enemies demonstrate unexpected respect. German prisoners found themselves acknowledging that an American cook had shown more understanding of their cultural needs than their own officers sometimes demonstrated, that someone they had been taught to consider racially inferior possessed knowledge and sensitivity that challenged every assumption about hierarchy, intelligence, and human worth. For Cornelius, the success represented more than culinary achievement. It demonstrated that respect could transcend racial and national boundaries, that cultural understanding could create bridges across chasms that institutional hatred insisted were permanent, that individual choices to see enemies as human beings could transform entire systems designed to maintain dehumanizing separation. He had succeeded where American military efficiency had failed, not through superior resources, but through superior empathy. The relationship that developed between Cornelius and Heinrich challenged everyone's preconceptions. Conversations began with cooking techniques, but expanded into cultural exchange that violated multiple institutional boundaries. A Black American and a German officer discovered shared experiences with marginalization, different forms of systematic exclusion that created unexpected common ground, different types of discrimination that generated similar psychological responses. Heinrich's post-war testimony would later describe these conversations as the most meaningful human contact he experienced during captivity. Cornelius had treated him not as a defeated enemy requiring processing, but as a person whose cultural identity deserved recognition and respect. In segregated America, where Black citizens faced systematic exclusion from full participation in democratic society, a Black soldier had demonstrated the kind of cultural sensitivity that white America rarely showed even to its own citizens. The transformation extended beyond individual relationships to systemic change. Camp Aliceville became a model for POW treatment, demonstrating that cultural respect improved security, health, and morale more effectively than rigid enforcement of American standards. Other camps began adopting similar approaches, recognizing that understanding enemy culture enhanced rather than threatened American military effectiveness. The irony was inescapable. In a nation where segregation denied Black Americans access to restaurants, schools, hospitals, and hotels available to white citizens, a Black cook had demonstrated superior understanding of human dignity than institutional systems designed by white authorities. His success challenged assumptions about intelligence, capability, and moral authority that justified racial discrimination, proving that respect for human dignity transcended the artificial boundaries that political systems insisted were natural and permanent. The broader implications reached beyond military policy to fundamental questions about democracy, equality, and the gap between American ideals and American practice. If a Black soldier could show more cultural sensitivity to German enemies than America showed to its own Black citizens, what did that reveal about the selective application of values that the nation claimed to represent universally? If respect for human dignity was possible across racial and national boundaries, why did institutional systems continue to deny such respect within American society? Years later, when Heinrich returned to Germany and eventually immigrated to America, he would seek out Cornelius to express gratitude that had only grown with time and distance. The friendship that began in a prison camp continued across decades. Two men who had discovered that human recognition transcended the artificial categories that military regulation and social prejudice attempted to maintain as permanent barriers to understanding and connection. The recipe card that Cornelius had developed for German-style Eintopf became a family treasure, passed down through generations as evidence that individual choices to respect human dignity could create change that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. His grandchildren would learn that their grandfather had saved lives not through military heroism, but through the simple recognition that enemies deserved the same cultural respect that he wished America would show to its own marginalized citizens. In the quiet of that mess hall, where 300 German soldiers had chosen starvation rather than cultural surrender, where American efficiency had failed to solve human problems that required human solutions, where segregation had created hierarchies that obscured rather than revealed human capability. In that space, food had become a bridge across boundaries that institutional hatred insisted were unbridgeable. The lesson was simple but revolutionary. Respect is a choice individuals can make regardless of official policies that discourage such choices. Dignity travels across any distance, transcends any uniform, survives any attempt to reduce human beings to categories requiring administrative processing. Sometimes it takes an enemy to teach us what home really means. And sometimes it takes someone society considers lowest to demonstrate the highest form of human recognition. If stories like this remind you that humanity persists despite systematic attempts to eliminate it, that individual choices can resist institutional dehumanization, that respect transcends boundaries, politics insists are permanent, then perhaps there are other moments of unexpected human connection worth remembering, worth honoring, worth carrying forward into whatever challenges require us to choose between the comfort of prejudice and the courage of recognition.